Hello and welcome to the latest BVCA podcast, The Mindful VC. My name is Chris Elphick, Head of Venture Capital at the BVCA, and we're going to discuss approaches to mental health for founders and investors with three fantastic VCs. First off, I'm delighted to introduce Daniel Waterhouse, who is the General Partner at Balderton, one of the largest and best-known VC funds in the UK and Europe. Daniel has been at Balderton for over a decade and worked with, invested in very well-known companies like Revolut, Zoe, Darktrace. Next up, we have Hayley Hand, who is an investment director at Better Society Capital, which is the UK's leading social impact investor, whose central mission is to increase investment in tackling social issues and inequalities across the UK. She's also a qualified coach and co-leads the coaching program at Impact VC, and she also works on several of the BVCA's training courses as well. Finally, Henrik Sanchez is the general partner at Playfair Capital, which is a generalist pre-seed fund that invests across Europe. And their investments include Thought Machine, Andela, and Orca AI. So the topic for this podcast is particularly relevant, not only that it's Mental Health Awareness Week, but it's also created some rather alarming headlines in recent weeks. A survey from Sifted showed that 76% of founders said their investors had had a negative impact on their mental health over the last 12 months. And nearly 44% said that the relationship with their VCs had gotten worse over the same period. So that's a pretty dispiriting starting point, I think. But the founder journey is never straightforward or easy. And looking after their mental health and well-being is vital to the long-term success of any VC investment. So one of the key skills for investors, I guess, is balancing the extent to which they should support their founders, giving them the tools they need to go and grow the company without getting in the way, but also knowing when to step in when the founder needs support. So we will explore some of these issues, suggest some practical steps that VCs can take in supporting the founders, and how LPs consider mental health in the funds they invest in, and the impact of tech on mental health more broadly. So, Daniel, I'd like to start with you by asking about the research that Balderton has done in this area and your overall approach to support mental well-being.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. For a long time, I think really from the kind of genesis of the firm, we've been very focused on taking a holistic approach to founders, delivering incredible performance. And maybe because some of our GPs and partners were also founders and have been through the same experience, they kind of have perspective that it's a difficult journey. And actually, like high-performance sports athletes, to get the best out of yourself, it doesn't mean running 1,000 miles an hour every second of the day. You need to be in great shape for the times when you do need to perform under high pressure. And so we began to develop some programs, but we wanted to really validate that our thinking was right. So we did a big survey last year. About 230 founders responded around the impact of stress and constant high pressure on founder and company performance. And 88% of founders came back and said they did believe that constant high pressure resulted in bad decision making. A similarly high percentage felt that intense levels of stress could result in poor business performance. And so it seems to validate that. And so as a consequence, we formalized what we've been doing, some of already, and launched our founder wellbeing and performance platform about a year ago, which has three elements. One is to provide access to a coach who is on our payroll but doesn't tell us what they talk about. Two is to continue to expand what we call CEO forums, which are groups of 7 or 8 CEOs from within the portfolio who we put together with a facilitator to help them build a really tight connection. And then those groups go off and self-organize and have become incredibly powerful units for the 7 or 8 founders to have other people to talk about what they're going through with. And then thirdly, in partnership with a group called Well Founded, we co-fund a program for CEO and founders to go through, which is a 6-month holistic health program where they get physical and mental health assessments and are able to work with coaches to maybe adapt their lifestyle around sleep or exercise or nutrition or approaches to mental health problems. And we've had about 50 CEOs go through that program now with exceptional feedback for the impact it's had on them.
That's really interesting. And having that forum where they can talk to the other CEOs and having a sort of private forum as well, where they can talk to someone about the things they're going through as well. That's a really interesting approach. Henrik, what do you as a firm do to support the founders, and what kind of relationship do you try to develop with them to encourage, to be open and honest about their mental health?
I think as Daniel was talking about, it all starts with the holistic approach you take. And I think for us, we're an earlier stage fund than Balderton. And so we're building founders and their companies up from the very beginning when they're usually 2 or 3 people and an idea. And so there's many more twists in that road before hopefully they get to often where Balderton come in and invest in a more established size business. And I think that means that we need to be a lot maybe closer just to the personal side as well as the professional side, feel closer to a sort of a mentor relationship maybe than a pure investor one, which I think we can do given we're coming in so early. And I think what we try and think about is what are some of the touch points that founders can have throughout a year that they know will always be there, and then what are some of the more like attitudes and cultures we can foster. So we do biannual founders dinners, which are very much centered around an equivalent of the founder forum idea, where founders can meet each other, meet the new cohorts, and then go and form some of those groups off the back of it that we can facilitate. We'll provide a kind of employee wellness program via HICA, which I believe Balderton also use. And it's one of our investments. And that basically gives a marketplace offering to anyone who signed up where they can choose any wellbeing kind of experience or benefit that they'd like, funded by Playfair. So we fund £50 a month for every founder, sort of ad infinitum. And the range there is everything from finding a therapist, very directly relevant, to reform Pilates classes or delivery of plants or whatever might make you feel just a little bit more relaxed or de-stressed. And then I think maybe the last thing is just a couple of examples we've seen where the holistic safe space you need to try and create. Mat leave is one big area that we've seen come up as incredibly high stress. And I think the only way in which some of our founders have felt comfortable talking to us first amongst an investor group is because they know that there is no judgment and it's purely us trying to help them figure out what's the best for them and for the company as a whole. And so I suppose to us, that's a really good indicator of they feel comfortable talking to us, not just as an investor, but also as the mentor that I mentioned at the beginning. And of course, that's just great news. And rather than coming to us and initially fearing our reaction, which I think tells you a lot about the founder perspective or mentality, assuming that an investor will be unhappy at the news of them potentially having a child. So I think I agree with the overall sentiment from founders in the market. And I think as investors, we need to be more proactive in addressing it.
And in what ways do you think the sort of tougher fundraising environment over the last year or two, where we see more down rounds, longer paths to exit? There was a few years ago, it felt like you could start a company when we had the real sort of boom time and you could get a decent exit in 2 to 3 years. And now that's definitely gone sort of stretched out again. Do you think this is sort of exacerbating some of those issues I mentioned earlier with the sort of sifted data between founders and investors? And do you think this will improve going forward?
Well, of course, yes. Some of the issues you mentioned, if it's hard to raise funding, then of course that's going to put additional pressure on you and increase the stress load as both an entrepreneur, founder, and also an investor, because you're kind of one order away from the stress of the founders and worrying about their success. It shouldn't mean, but obviously the data doesn't agree with that the relationship between investors and founders should get worse in more stressful times. But unfortunately, that seems to be the case, which means that investors are not helping the founders go through this more difficult journey in the right way. And I think a lot of this really, what we're discussing, boils down to founders building the muscle to cope with periods of intense stress and to perform exceptionally well in those periods. And the same goes for their investors. We have to develop those muscles so that in these difficult times, you're a steady hand and a thoughtful, considered, balanced voice rather than another stressed voice around the table worried about these problems. And so we've all got to build those muscles, and that's partly what the program is about, is helping founders be in the best shape possible for dealing with the difficult moments, and then reflecting those difficult moments well into the organization to get the best out of everyone, versus kind of going into a state of panic or high stress and transferring that load to other people, which just cascades the problem. And the investor plays a part in that, right? If I turn up at a board meeting and I'm highly stressed, agitated, kind of worried about all the details and not stepping back and providing helpful perspective in those difficult times, then that's going to just add to the problem. And maybe that's what we're seeing a bit, at least in some cases.
Henrik, do you want to add anything there?
As a pre-seed fund, we actually have a slightly different approach to, I think, a lot of other very early stage pre-seed or seed type funds, which is we're only investing in 6 companies a year, whereas many would do 2 or 3 times that number. And I think the reason we've gone down that route is again back to this holistic point, which is we don't feel like per partner, per kind of company or deal lead, you can really manage more than 6 or 8 companies and therefore founders at any one time and be a proper coach to them. And so I think where I've seen the divergence in a supportive but challenging board member, or a obstructive or stress creating and challenging board member, is where you don't really understand the detail and the context enough to either be in the micro detail or then zoom out to Daniel's point and understand the macro and give perspective. And I think that's where the stress really comes from, because an investor fundamentally has their own job to worry about, and they're getting pressure from their IC and their LPs, and they need to figure out why revenue isn't growing, or as usually it's as basic as that. It's why is revenue not growing? And obviously there are many more levers below that, and a lot of value of businesses come from other areas than purely revenue growth. And so I think if you're able to challenge on something below the surface, so potentially why customer churn on a new mobile launch of a product is maybe not working, that's an area to spend time on and actually is constructive. But telling the founders they need to grow more is probably not. But it's very hard to do that unless you have the context. And frankly, it's very hard for some investors to appreciate that when they have so many portfolio companies. So I think that's a structural issue, but maybe one for people to bear in mind, and therefore just go a bit easier on the high level challenges.
Daniel, you touched on this, that the investor is the best way to consider themselves is as a coach and optimizing what they can do, because being a founder is very stressful, but working in a high stress way and kind of performing through those high stress times, what is a high anxiety role? So what's the best way that investors can do this and be a coach and help founders reach their sort of maximum performance, as it were?
Yeah, we can do some of it, and there are lots of different people that a founder can lean on to get support, and coaches is an important word, and they should have independent coaches as well as coaches who are their investors. What we have is the benefit of having seen a lot of different situations, and hopefully some of that perspective. And so that's where I kind of focus coaching founders, is to just try and give them context for what they're going through from other experiences and how other people have gone through some of those challenges, and then to help them get perspective, particularly for first-time founders who are facing a whole set of challenges for the first time. So that's important. I think within all of this, ultimately, what you want to have is transparency. And the problem with an antagonistic relationship is it doesn't encourage transparency. So our approach is to very much be on the side of the founder, to try and understand in the detail, as Henrik says, what they're dealing with, and then to have honest conversations about these things, and not to overreact, and to provide that perspective.
Just from my perspective, I think setting expectations, particularly really early on in the relationship, really helps. What does work-life balance actually mean? And being explicit about it. I think often, well, particularly as a Brit, and we invested lots of other British founders, we're quite prone to not speaking our mind and not being explicit enough. And so I think encouraging things like taking a proper holiday after a funding round, because that is maybe one of the best times and after the biggest period of stress, and actually suggesting that and making founders feel comfortable about that, ensuring they are just taking a holiday all throughout the year. There's often a weird complex or heroism around not taking holiday. And those are very easy things to actually address and encourage as a kind of culture. And obviously you don't need permission for investors to take holiday, but you can encourage that behavior. So I think those are some of the simple cultural things you can start with. And then, as Daniel talked about, you need to enable professionals to do that job around you. We're not going to pretend that as investors we are also professional coaches. Some are, which is brilliant. It's something that I think I'd consider, and maybe others at Playfair would consider, because I think it's such a vital part of the role. But in the meantime, finding other people that can be professionals and do that for founders in the right way.
Hayley, is there anything that you'd like to highlight?
A lot of the conversations can be around taking that step back and figuring out what you need, and actually that you do need something, rather than to keep on going and having that realization. And I think particularly what's really important is understanding how that plays out in the context of a co-founder relationship, and how you can get support and articulate that to your co-founder, because there may well be ebbs and flows where one feels kind of they're feeling this more than the other. And so really kind of encouraging that openness in that relationship can be really important.
Brilliant, thank you. Going back to, you mentioned this earlier, Daniel, about sort of board governance. And I think, that can also be quite difficult for founders sometimes because obviously in VC, you can have a range of investors on your board and various others, and they might be pulling in slightly different directions. So just maybe some of your thoughts on how you can work on that and make sure that that works.
It can be a really, really big problem if you have, particularly for the later stage companies where they've maybe got several investor directors on the board, and if those investor directors are either misaligned or stylistically very different, or just frankly uncoordinated, that can be really, really difficult for the team, because they're probably getting mixed messages. They're getting requests do lots of different update calls. They're getting some people who are responsive, some people are not responsive, and in the worst case, they've got someone who is really disruptive and is a blocker, and so that can get very difficult. And on the investor side, it's up to us to get our act together as investor directors and be coordinated. And so too many boards, people turn up and there's been no preparation, or there's no kind of alignment, and people come from many different perspectives, and it gets a bit disjointed. So we can do better as investors to make sure we are, as much as we can, we're not always going to agree with each other, but somewhat aligned, so that there's a kind of more consistent approach to the company. And then I think for the founders, it's why it's important to start thinking about how you build your board from an early point of view, and how you maybe think about bringing non-investors into the mix, whether that's a kind of a non-exec kind of expertise sort of person, but who also maybe has some experience at boards and can provide some balance, or ultimately getting a chair in there. And I think for companies where there are many investors, a chair can be invaluable, because they diffuse all of that, well, not all of it, but much of that, because they be the interface between a disparate group of investor opinions and the CEO, and get things working in a more orderly fashion. So I think two sides to it. We have to be mindful that it's really not helpful being uncoordinated, and two, the CEO should be really thinking about what else do I need in the mix that makes this board work better, and that's sometimes bringing an independent voice and perspective.
And just from an early stage point of view, often I find my role or our role is post Series A, actually kind of moving a little bit more to an informal, slightly behind the scenes type investor role, where we've known the founder for 2-3 years, have a very close relationship, and it's not to say that we're trying to necessarily back channel in a Machiavellian type way in the board, but actually we can be an outlet to the founders to say, I've got this whole new group of people who potentially in a accelerated fundraising process just fundamentally don't know the new investors super well yet. And so there is some of this misalignment that Daniel's referring to that just takes a little bit of time to unpick. And I think we can be an outlet for the founders, and even then back channel ourselves back to the investors that we probably know slightly better, because we're in a very small ecosystem, and smooth out some of these kind of rougher edges. I'd say we end up doing that in at least 50% of our companies in the sort of 6 to 12 months post Series A. It's very, very common. And I don't think it's a reflection really on anyone in particular. There's no blame to be thrown around, but we are in quite a privileged position to be able to, I think, solve it as a more like neutral party. That's obviously us in particular, but I think any pre-seed investor or maybe a significant angel who's very close to all parties can also play that role. So founders who are able to find someone like that would probably benefit a lot.
Hayley, as an LP, what do you look for in VCs and their approach to founder mental health?
We want VCs to take founder mental health really seriously. I mean, for all the reasons that have already been discussed, that is really the best thing for the founder themselves, but also the best thing for the business. Chris, as you demonstrated at the start with some of the sifted research, VCs are part of the system that does put pressure on the well-being of founders. At the same time, we think that forward-thinking VCs can also be part of the system that contributes to tackling poor founder well-being and supporting them in their well-being. And so that's what we're looking for when we're looking to invest. I mean, we see across our VC portfolio and wider programs like Ada Ventures offering mental health support to all founders in their portfolio. Ananda Ventures have a founders health program that includes an Ananda founder health clause that they put in all of their term sheets. And we've seen other funds, I think particularly interesting, like Masawa's Nurture Capital approach. So it focuses on founder well-being, but it also includes a mental health package to help with closure for unsuccessful and transitioning founders. I think we've discussed a bit this before, but a common theme that we see across a lot of those programs is on creating that space to talk about what is going on for the founder. I think the Sifted research showed that more and more founders are using the support of a coach to provide that space. I think it was 28% regularly see a coach. And yeah, I've first-hand experience of this and how important it is to have someone there who's really focusing on that founder well-being and what they need. Founders a lot of the time talk about their investors need something, their team needs something, their co-founder needs something, their family and friends need something from them. So creating a space where someone doesn't need something from them, it's kind of what do they need themselves can be really important. So at Better Society Capital, I think we've seen this really, really vital to the success of founders. And that's why we've launched the coaching program for founders and VCs through Impact VC. I think I just want to also pick up on something that Henrik said around the kind of stresses of being a founder are not necessarily felt equally for some groups at all. And so the demands like full-on hours, regular firefighting can be particularly tough on women who are shouldering the majority of caring responsibilities in many cases. I know Henrik mentioned around the maternity leave point. We think that VCs can play a key role in supporting women through this. So an Ada that I mentioned before, they last year launched a offer to cover the cost of backup childcare to cover the gaps created by childcare arrangements falling through to the founders of their portfolio. And so the aim is, especially for really early stage founders, to remove like a meaningful financial burden and therefore stress for them.
Yeah, I mean, just on the term sheet clause, I think in the last maybe 5 years, we've seen a lot of focus on ESG clauses going into term sheets, rightly so. I think it's called the Founder Mental Health Pledge Clause, is a term sheet clause that actually allows founders to direct a portion of the investment funds towards directly addressing mental health. That's something that, we've now inserted into all of our term sheets. And I think there's quite a growing group of investors starting in the US and increasingly in Europe that are looking to do the same. So I think some of those real put your money where your mouth is type initiatives can go a long way.
I think that's great. I mean, it's kind of interesting whether that comes from the fund or from the management company. We fund all of our programs from the management company, whereas I think the kind of pledge funds it from the fund. But that's probably a different point. You've got to look at all the stressors and the inhibitors of performance. And Hayley picked up on some really important ones, such as childcare and raising a family in parallel with building a company, and financial stresses of bootstrapping a company for years and years and years, and what that does to you. So I think all of these things we should be thinking about. How do we help provide solutions that kind of minimize these stresses to let the founders live a healthy, happy life, but also be the best version of themselves in building their companies?
As an LP, sort of thinking about investors as well, the fundraising journey especially for first-time funds and emerging managers has also been very difficult in the last couple of years. And I've read that people describe the journey for people raising funds like that. It's similar to the founder journey, but with less precipitous highs and lows. So can you explain what you look for when you're investing in a team and how they manage this within the VCs themselves?
I completely agree with that, being very similar to the founder journey, especially for emerging managers. And I think what Daniel was saying around building that muscle for intense stress, as you're kind of trying to support founders do that, you need to be doing that yourself as well, because it's definitely going to be a stressful job. From an LP perspective, like the wellness of teams in VCs themselves is really essential. I mean, it takes over a decade to deliver a fund. So the team needs to be really set up to succeed over that period. A key part of how we look at this, I suppose, is how it shows up in their culture, that there is really an environment where teams can share how they're feeling and be supported in that. And that's what we try and look at in our assessment of managers, spending time with the teams, talking to team members individually, observing meetings that they're having to try and get a sense of what that culture is like. So, yeah, we look to really understand particularly how in teams they become aware of when themselves and others need support, so that there are some channels for communication there, be that, surveys if it's a bit of a larger team, or if it's one-on-one check-ins, if it's a smaller team, as many VCs are. But then also, I suppose, when they are aware of what's going on, that there is some support in place for those who need it. So we see VCs offering wellness budgets to their employees, carving out hours to focus on wellness, and lots of other things, linking it back to the ESG point that was mentioned before. I think this is a key part of our ESG diligence, especially obviously the S on the social side, to look at people-centered approaches. That whole culture piece really comes into that and what we look at.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think that now that sort of building of ESG into, LPs and their investing principles, I think is really important, sort of driving that forward. Daniel, Henrik, is this something that you see in your interactions with LPs as well? VC is not like a typical business. It's a partnership. People can have their own money in the fund. It has sort of additional types of stress. And do you see LPs sort of being aware of this and thinking about, the sort of balance within the VC firm itself?
I'm not sure we see a lot of it. I mean, I think what Hayley and the team do is exceptional, and and it's great to shine a focus on it. Obviously, the LP GP relationship is a bit different from a kind of GP founder relationship in that the number of touch points and the regularity of touch points is far less. In a fund you will have 25 to 30 LPs, and they're not turning up to a board meeting each month and phoning you have chatting to you every 3 days about the problems you're facing in building your venture capital firm and the stresses you've got. It's obviously not quite as a close relationship, and so those topics don't naturally come up. I do find that when we talk to LPs, they're very, very receptive and understand the importance of what we've been doing to help our companies, and so I think it is on their minds. But obviously, it's not something that there's more any real structure around for the majority of them.
Yeah, for us, we turn the Playfair Wellness program for founders internally and do offer the same for the team. That's one start. I think honestly, where the biggest stress comes from for the VC job, I think, is the long feedback cycles. You fundamentally don't know you're doing a good job until you return cash or multiples of cash over probably a 10 to 15 year time frame, particularly if you're a pre-seed fund. So I think as a manager, being able to, for yourself and for us, your team, find alternative proxies to give people a sense of career path, a sense of success, a sense of progress is really helpful and really important. What we do at a portfolio level is think about sort of graduation rate to Series A as one proxy for building companies that are quote unquote real companies solving real problems with real impact, or founder NPS. Founders appreciate the way that we work with them and that we're doing things the right way. And then internally having a number of different sort of checkpoints and frameworks for what good looks like at each level, from sort of analyst, associate, principal, partner, etc. So I think transparency fundamentally, same with the founder side, is the most important, and having a clear path that people can then have certainty, I suppose, of what they need to do, even if they ultimately aren't able to get there for whatever reason.
So the BVCA, we did some research on the main qualities for founders and investors and what they need to succeed a few years ago. And the most commonly identified trait was resilience. Do you agree with this? Are there any others you'd like to highlight? And should we maybe be more honest about the all-consuming nature of building a tech company, investing in tech companies and the pressure that creates?
I think the biggest emotion this elicits from me is almost frustration that resilience and mental health are sort of mutually exclusive. I think that's the biggest misnomer that fundamentally we need to address, is that you can be resilient and still have high stress or mental health issues. And it depends. We're obviously making that a very broad category, but some of them can be totally unrelated to whether or not you're working hard or resilient. And so I think be able to separate these things out and give people the ability to put the right inputs in, find work-life balance, find support around you from a more professional point of view, but also a more kind of personal therapeutic point of view, and then also just be able to zoom out and understand that these things are normal and happen to lots of people, and there isn't this sort of quote unquote perfect setup where you have absolutely no drag. Making it less of a tech crunch heroism would give everyone a lot more certainty that actually having a few challenges and a few bumps in the road and a few drags on your day-to-day is entirely normal, and you just need to get the right support to make it sustainable.
I agree with that. Resilience, of course, is important. And if you've got to take the knocks, get up and get back on with it. But taken to the extreme, resilience is kind of causing the problems we're talking about, right? Which is, some people think resilience is, I just have to keep taking more and more pressure, and it doesn't matter how bad it gets or how many problems I've got, I'm just going to keep going, just bloody minded, one direction. And so if you have that just in isolation, that's maybe dangerous. You need to have self-awareness as you go through that. You need to be constantly thinking about personal development, because to be resilient for the next set of challenges is going to take a different mindset, a different set of skills than maybe when you first started the company. And so if you're not again building all these different muscles of leadership, of mental acuity, of stress management, then at some point resilience is going to cause you to hit a wall and you won't be able to take it anymore. And so out of that, the self-awareness and the journey of self-improvement are also critical. What you see in great leaders, they transform themselves over the years that they go from a seed company to a IPO into very different people. And part of that is absolutely how they deal with stress and build their kind of mental acuity.
I completely agree. And I think the way that resilience is talked about is in quite binary, either like you have it or you don't, and really echo the sentiment that it definitely changes over time. And when those leaders are transforming, it looks very different for them at different stages and what they need to have that resilience. Another point of your question, Chris, around the all-consuming nature of tech and the pressure it creates. It is a high-pressured environment. I'd come back to, Daniel, I know you were quoting some results from your survey around, say 88% say constant high pressure leads to bad decision-making. So, where that high pressure is actually productive and where that high pressure isn't productive, and what VCs can do about that.
Thank you, Hayley. Going more sort of big picture now, there have been multiple studies, and especially in young people, the increasing role that tech plays in their lives, but it also can lead to poorer mental health and things like this with new technologies and phones, etc. I'm not sure if any of you have any examples of companies you've invested in, or to what extent is tech the problem, but to what extent can it be part of the solution?
I think both, right? I mean, clearly, I think it's well understood that the fact that we've got constant, always on emails, social media, notifications, global news flow just blasting into our faces 24/7 is not very healthy. You're just on a kind of constant on state of alertness as a consequence of that. And so, social media and phones have caused some challenges in that regard. But like anything to be managed, and kind of part of working out, do you engage with technologies, make sure those things don't become actually destructive. On the flip side, though, of course, technology has done some amazing things. We spend a lot of time looking at preventative healthcare, and part of these programs are around awareness of where your lifestyle is damaging both for your physical and mental well-being. Good example, many founders will find that their diet deteriorates quite badly through their journey because they don't have time to get access to good food, they eat at the wrong times, etc. And we've had multiple founders who've been through Well-Founded who found that and became aware of that and did a lot of work on it. And we're investors in Zoe, the nutritional science company, which has done an incredible job and solving your nutritional solution. What is the best fuel for your body, and that's what Zoe helps you do, has a massive impact on your mental health because it changes your energy levels, it changes your sleep, it changes so much about your life, and that of course has a knock-on effect to your mental health. And then there's obviously a lot of sleep apps and meditation apps. All of these things can help people get some balance and kind of rewire their lifestyle to be healthier.
Yeah, I would definitely echo the opportunity we see for tech ventures to tackle mental health issues. It's a really big part of the underlying portfolio that we have at Better Society Capital. As Daniel said, the tech nature of it means that you can provide really tailored and flexible support, but also means you can scale that support really quickly and put it in the hands of those that really need it. And we see this similarly in areas around kind of prevention, early intervention, and particularly recovery as well. One thing I think is really important is that the interventions are backed up by research, and that founders and investors are getting that feedback loop from users as to how effective it is in helping them with their mental health and where there might be, creating risks to their mental health. We see that kind of feedback loop across a number of companies in our underlying portfolio. I can share some examples across our portfolio. So, for example, Spill, which offers next day one-to-one therapy sessions with teams, it reduces symptoms of employee low mood by over 70%. Together, we talked about kind of building a community of people who are going through the same things as you earlier. Together, do that where people can support each other to improve mental health and well-being. Millions of people have access to that service in the UK through participating employers. And again, over 60% of people who use that service say that the Together All community help them more than other sources of support. As Daniel mentioned, tech can play a really important role in tackling the drivers of poor mental health if we kind of take a step back and look a bit broader. For example, there's a really strong link between financial well-being and mental health. And here we see a lot of examples of tech focused on financial inclusion in our portfolio that have a positive impact on well-being. So, for example, WageStream offers a host of tools to improve financial health, and over 70% of their users feel less stressed about money after using the platform.
That's really positive. Moving on to my final question. Do any of you have examples of well-being hacks that help you with your mental health?
The two I would talk about would be, I don't know if Android has the same as Apple, but just the focus modes that have been introduced quite recently, I found incredibly helpful, at least just segmenting my headspace and trying to reduce what Daniel and Hayley were talking about there around just this constant stream of information and pulls on your time. So just having the bravery of just shutting things out for a period of time. I think the other one is just forcing yourself to go for a walk. I mean, it's the simplest thing in the world, but it is just been proven time and time again to really just relax the mind and just kind of put a lot of building stresses at ease. So even if it's just a 10-minute run outside and see some fresh air, it's a small thing, and it's not going to solve some of the much bigger issues we talked about today, but it is a day-to-day hack, I think.
Yeah, I think for me and like Henrik was saying, it's not going to solve kind of the bigger issues, but reminding myself to ask myself, what do I need? Is it the fact that I haven't been out for a walk, or I haven't, been to the office in a while and seen my colleagues and I need that connection? Is it that I haven't drunk enough water? That kind of stuff, just checking in on what I need. There is a really interesting company that I use that's part of our underlying portfolio called Spoke, which is an organization that kind of works with musicians and psychologists to create music to help with different moods. And that's a really kind of nice way of supporting your mental health by listening to music, similarly to music you would listen to anyway, but it can be really, really effective.
It's not really a hack, it's something reprogramming, I guess. But I think the reprogramming, once you can shift your mind from thinking that if I have a minute to spare, I need to do some more work, to I need to find some space in my life to do something else, whether that's exercise, sleep more, find some better food, do some meditation, whatever it is, you've got to work out what your thing is. Once you've got it worked out that if you make that space for yourself, it's going to have profound impacts on your energy levels and your performance, then you're off to the races. Absent that, my two mini hacks, one is get outside as soon as you can at the start of the day. When you get direct sunlight, it starts your circadian rhythm off for the day, so it helps with your sleep routine, but it also just kind of gives you a nice kind of connection. And the second one is, if you're really stressed, breathe through your left nostril, because that left nostril breathing stimulates your parasympathetic nervous system, which is what helps you relax and de-stress a bit. So that's a nice easy one to do.
That's brilliant. I love the left nostril one. I've not heard that one. I'm definitely going to be trying that one out. Thank you very much. The only ones I'd add, especially having young children, is actually going down the pub at the end of the week with friends and just getting a chance to unwind that way. Might be a bit old-fashioned, but I always find that works for me. That brings us to the end of the conversation today, and I'd like to give a big thank you to Daniel, Hayley and Henrik for their insights on what's a really important topic, and one that I think the industry can do more to improve, and they really gave us some fantastic ideas. So before we finish, I'd just like to flag that we have our Accelerate conference coming up later in May, on the 21st and 22nd of May, where we'll cover some of the topics that we discussed today, as well as other areas like neurodiversity, the impact of AI on VC, and how we can create a European Silicon Valley, all of which sound like excellent topics for the next podcast. So I'll close by wishing you all a very healthy week ahead, both mentally and physically, and thank you so much for listening.